A homeless girl returns a loaf of bread to the cashier. A millionaire sees it and changes the poor girl's life. What no one knew was that the child carried a past he tried to erase. By taking her home, he awakened enemies and truths that should have remained buried. And when the media exploded, it was already too late to turn back. His name was on every headline. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us what city you're watching from. Now, on with the story. The mansion on the Upper East Side had always been quiet, but in recent years, the silence had the taste of abandonment. Walter Sterling, at 73, walked through the wide corridors like a ghost in his own home. The Persian rugs that had once welcomed hundreds of guests now muffled only his solitary footsteps. The crystal chandeliers remained gleaming, but there were no more parties to illuminate. Everything remained impeccable, thanks to the work of Mrs. Marlene, the housekeeper who cared for that empty palace with the same dedication as always, even without any real life between those walls. Walter had built an empire. He started with a small market in the Bronx in the 70s, when he was still a young man full of dreams and drive. He would wake up before sunrise, carry boxes, serve customers, and count coins until late at night. He married Helen, the daughter of a neighboring bakery owner, a woman with an easy smile and a generous heart. Together they made the business grow. One market became 2, then 5, then 15. By the 90s, they owned a respectable chain. In the early 2000s, Sterling Markets was synonymous with quality and trust in New York City and the tri-state area. But success came at a price. The long hours, the trips, the endless meetings, all of it stole the time Walter could have spent at home. Helen understood, or at least she tried. She took care of their daughter, Beatrice, while her husband took care of the business. The girl grew up seeing her father more in newspaper photographs than in the living room. Still, there was love in that family. Or there was, until the day everything fell apart. Beatrice was 22 when she became pregnant. She was in her final year of business administration, dating a young man Walter never approved of. Lucas was a musician, playing guitar in bars, dreaming of an artistic career. To Walter, that wasn't a future. It was a fantasy. He wanted his daughter to marry someone of means, someone who could add to the empire he had built with so much sweat. When Beatrice announced her pregnancy, Walter's world collapsed. He didn't see a granddaughter on the way. He saw a mistake, a detour, a stain on the family's reputation. The argument was terrible. Helen tried to calm her husband, asked him to listen to their daughter, to try to understand. But Walter was blinded by anger and pride. He said things he should never have said. He called Beatrice irresponsible, said she was throwing away all the opportunities he had given her. He demanded that she end the relationship, that she reconsider everything. Beatrice, with the same stubbornness she had inherited from her father, refused. She said she loved Lucas, that they would have the baby, that they would build their own life. Walter then did something he would carry as a weight for the rest of his days. He gave her an ultimatum. Either she gave up that relationship, or she was no longer welcome in his house. Beatrice chose love. She left home that same night, taking only a suitcase with clothes and some old photographs. Helen cried for days, begging her husband to take it back, to call their daughter home. But Walter was locked in his pride. He said Beatrice would be back as soon as reality came knocking, that she would realize the mistake she was making. But Beatrice never came back. Months passed. Helen tried to stay in touch with her daughter in secret, but Beatrice asked her mother not to put herself between her and her father. She said she needed time, that one day things would resolve themselves. But time is cruel to those who wait for reconciliation. 3 years after the fight, Helen discovered a health problem. The diagnosis came too late. She spent the last months of her life asking her husband to find Beatrice to make peace. Walter promised, but he never followed through. He always found an excuse, always postponed it. Until one day Helen passed away, and with her went the last bridge that still connected Walter to his daughter. After that, Walter threw himself into his work. He expanded the market chain, opened new branches, multiplied his profits. But the house remained empty, the bed cold, the days meaningless. He tried to locate Beatrice a few times, but always gave up before completing the search. Pride was still stronger than longing. He preferred to imagine that his daughter was well, somewhere far away, happy with her choice. It was easier than facing the truth. The years piled up. Walter grew old alone. Mrs. Marlene took care of the house's routine, but there was no way to fill the emptiness that took over every room. At night, when the silence was absolute, Walter would sometimes enter the room that had been Beatrice's. Everything was still as she had left it. The made bed, the books on the shelf, the old guitar leaning in the corner. Helen had insisted that nothing be touched. She said Beatrice would come back. Walter never had the courage to change anything after his wife was gone. One morning, Walter woke up with a strange feeling, an anguish that tightened his chest, a restlessness he couldn't name. He had his coffee alone, as always, but something about that day was different. He looked out the window and saw the city's movement. Cars, people, life happening outside. And he inside just existing, breathing but not living. Suddenly he felt an urgent need to go out, to be among people, to feel that he was still part of the world. He called for Mrs. Marlene and told her he was going out. She found it odd, as it had been months since Walter had gone, out alone except for work commitments. He asked her to lay out simple clothes for him, a pair of jeans, a plain shirt, a baseball cap. He wanted to go unnoticed. He didn't want to be the owner of Sterling Markets. He wanted to be just another face in the crowd. Marlene obeyed, although she found it very strange. Walter took one of the most discreet cars from the garage and drove to the Bronx, where it all began. He parked near the old address of the First Market, which was now a modern store in his own Sterling Markets chain. He went inside in disguise, blending in with the customers. He watched people choosing products, talking, living their routines. There was something comforting in that normality. There, he was nobody. Just another old man in a cap doing his shopping. It was then that he saw the scene that would change everything. At the next checkout, a girl no more than 10 years old was trying to pay for a loaf of bread with a few coins she held in her dirty hand. The cashier counted the coins and shook her head. She was a few cents short. The girl looked at the bread as if it were the most precious treasure in the world. The cashier, a middle-aged woman with a tired but kind look, took the bread and said in a low voice that the girl could take it anyway, that she would pay the difference. But the girl stepped back. She said no, that it wasn't right, that she would come back when she had the full amount, and she left the store with her head held low but with her dignity intact. Walter was paralyzed. There was something about that child that touched him deeply. The way she spoke, the firmness in her voice despite her evident poverty, the refusal to accept what was not hers by right. Something in that gesture reminded him of Beatrice as a child. The same stubbornness, the same honor. Without much thought, Walter left his groceries in the cart and went after the girl. She walked slowly through the streets, looking at shop windows, collecting cans along the way. Walter followed her at a safe distance, trying to understand who this child was, why she was alone where she lived. The girl turned corners, crossed avenues until she reached a more run-down area of the neighborhood. She stopped in front of an abandoned building with broken windows and graffiti-covered walls. She looked around, making sure no one saw her, and slipped through an opening in the side. Walter waited a few minutes and then approached. He could hear children's voices coming from inside the building. He peeked through the opening, and what he saw left him breathless. The girl was sitting on the cement floor, surrounded by 4 even smaller children. A boy of perhaps 7, 2 little ones who looked to be 4 or 5, and an infant, in arms who couldn't have been more than 2 years old. The girl was dividing some pieces of old bread she had in a bag with them. She gave to the little ones first, then to the older boy, and only ate after everyone had been served. Walter backed away, stunned. He returned to his car with shaky legs. He sat behind the wheel and stayed there, unable to drive, processing what he had just seen. That girl was taking care of 4 children, alone, on the streets. And yet, she maintained her principles. She had dignity. She didn't accept easy charity. Who was she? Where did she come from? Why was she in that situation? For the next few days, Walter couldn't get the image of that scene out of his head. He returned to the spot several times, always in disguise, always watching from afar. He discovered that the girl left early every day, took the younger children to a safe hidden spot, and spent the day collecting recyclables, asking for leftovers at bakeries, doing odd jobs. In the afternoon, she would return with what she had managed to get and divide everything with the little ones. She, herself, barely ate. She seemed more concerned with ensuring the others were okay. Walter began to create situations to test the girl's honesty. He would let some coins fall near her, waiting to see what she would do. She always returned them. Once he purposely left a dollar bill on a park bench where she often passed. The girl picked up the money, looked around for the owner, and when she found no one, she handed it to a passing police officer, saying someone had lost it. Walter watched everything from a distance, increasingly impressed and intrigued. The more he watched her, the more he noticed similarities with Beatrice. It wasn't just the stubbornness or the honesty. There was something in the features of her face, in the way she furrowed her brow when she was concentrating, in the way she bit her lip when she was worried. Walter began to feel a growing suspicion, a possibility that both terrified and filled him with hope. One day, he gathered his courage and approached her. The girl was sitting on a small park bench, trying to fix one of the torn sneakers of one of the younger boys. Walter sat on the bench next to her, pretending to read a newspaper. After a few minutes, he struck up a conversation. He asked for her name. She hesitated, but answered, "Laura." He asked if she lived nearby. Laura was evasive, saying yes, nearby. Walter wanted to know about her little siblings. Laura said she took care of them because they had no one else. Walter felt his heart ache. In the following days, Walter kept showing up. He always brought something, a snack, a piece of fruit, a bottle of water. Laura accepted it for the little ones, but always with suspicion. She asked why he was doing it. Walter said he liked to help, that he wanted nothing in return. Slowly, Laura began to open up. She said she had been living on the streets for over a year, that her mother worked a lot, that she got sick, that one day she just didn't come back, that she then took over the care of her siblings, who weren't all blood siblings, but they were family all the same. Walter listened to every word with a heavy heart. He asked about Laura's mother, what her name was, where she worked. Laura said, the name in a choked voice, Beatrice. She cleaned offices at night, did housekeeping during the day. She was always tired, but she was a loving mother, until she got sick. She grew weaker, but continued to work because she had to. One day she collapsed at work. She was taken to a public hospital. She was hospitalized for a few weeks. Laura managed to visit her sometimes. Beatrice would hold her daughter's hand and apologize for not being able to take better care of her. She said life had been hard, but she never regretted her choices. One day, when Laura went to visit, the bed was empty. A nurse said that Beatrice had passed away during the night and that she had left an envelope. Laura took a yellowed and crumpled envelope from her pocket. Inside there was a letter and an old photograph. The photograph showed a young, beautiful woman embracing a middle-aged man in front of a market. Laura didn't know who the man was. Beatrice never talked about the past. But in the letter, she asked Laura, when she could, to try to find her grandfather. She said he lived in a big mansion on the Upper East Side, that he owned a chain of markets, that maybe if she told him the truth he would take her in. But Laura never had the courage. She was afraid of being rejected, and besides, she had to take care of the little ones. She couldn't just abandon them to go after a grandfather who didn't even know she existed. Walter held the photograph with trembling hands. It was him, younger, next to Beatrice, at the inauguration of the 10th market in the chain. That photograph was over 20 years old. His tears fell on the faded paper. He looked at Laura, at those eyes that were the same as Beatrice's, and he knew without a shadow of a doubt. This was his granddaughter. He tried to speak, but his voice wouldn't come out. Laura noticed something was wrong and got scared. Walter finally managed to say, his voice broken, that he was the man in the photograph, that he was the grandfather Beatrice had mentioned in the letter. Laura backed away, incredulous. She looked at the old man in simple clothes and a worn-out cap, then at the photo, then back at him. It wasn't possible. But Walter's eyes told the truth, and Laura, even so young, recognized the truth in that gaze. What happened next was a mixture of shock, anger, confusion, and pain. Laura wanted to know why he had never looked for her mother, why Beatrice had to suffer so much alone. Walter had no answers that could justify his neglect. He just said that he had been proud, a coward, that he had made a terrible mistake, that he had spent years regretting it, but never had the courage to fix it. Laura cried tears of anger and relief at the same time. Anger for everything her mother had gone through, relief for finally not being alone anymore. But then something changed. Laura started to feel sick, dizziness, weakness. Walter realized the girl was on the verge of collapse, malnutrition, exhaustion, months of sacrifice taking their toll. She tried to hide it, said she was fine, but she fainted in his arms before she could finish the sentence. Walter screamed for help, picked up the girl in his arms, and ran with her to the car. He gathered the other children who were crying in fear and drove at high speed to the nearest hospital. Laura was admitted immediately. The doctors said she was severely malnourished, dehydrated, anemic. A few more days in those conditions and it might have been too late. Walter didn't leave her side. He arranged for the best care, paid for the little ones to be examined as well. They were all frail, but Laura was in the most critical condition. She had given everything she had to keep the others alive. While Laura fought for her recovery, Walter took care of the children. He brought them to the mansion, provided them with new clothes, food, hot baths, and soft beds. The children, who had never known such comfort, walked around the house with wide eyes. Mrs. Marlene, initially shocked, soon grew fond of the little ones and began to care for them with affection. Walter also hired a private investigator. He needed to know the whole truth about what had happened to Beatrice. The report arrived days later, and each line was a stab to Walter's heart. Beatrice had worked until the last day of her life. She raised Laura alone, with sporadic help from Lucas, who never achieved financial stability but always loved his daughter. Lucas had also passed away, the victim of an accident when Laura was 6. From then on, Beatrice took on everything herself. She did housekeeping, worked in restaurant kitchens, took any honest job. She never asked her father for help. She never went back on her choice. She maintained her dignity until the end, and in her final days, she wrote that letter forgiving Walter, asking him to take care of Laura if anything happened to her. Walter read and reread the letter Laura had shown him. Beatrice's words were of genuine forgiveness, unconditional love, and hope that her father could have a second chance. She held no grudge, only sadness that they had not reconciled in life. Walter cried as he hadn't cried since Helen passed. He cried for the daughter he had lost, for the granddaughter he had almost lost too, for the years wasted on pride and resentment. When Laura finally woke up days later, she found her grandfather sitting by her bed. He was holding her hand as if he feared she would disappear. Laura looked around, confused, then remembered everything. She asked about the little ones. Walter assured her they were fine, safe, and fed. Laura began to cry, not from sadness but from relief. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't alone carrying the world on her shoulders. Walter then made a vow. He told Laura that he would never abandon her again, that he would take care of her and the children, that he would do everything in his power to make up for the mistakes of the past. Laura, still fragile, just nodded. It wasn't easy to trust. Life had taught her not to trust easily. But there was something in her grandfather's eyes, a sincerity, a deep regret, that made her believe that maybe, just maybe, things could be different from now on. The days in the hospital turned into weeks of recovery. Laura gained weight, color, strength. Walter visited her every day, always bringing something, always trying to win his granddaughter's trust. He told stories about Beatrice as a child, showed old photographs, talked about Helen. Laura listened attentively, discovering a past she had never known. Slowly, between stories and silences, a bond was formed, still fragile but real. When Laura was discharged, Walter took her home. The mansion on the Upper East Side, which had been a mausoleum of silence for so long, was suddenly full of life. The children ran through the corridors, laughed, played. Laura still found all the luxury strange, but she was beginning to allow herself to relax. For the first time, she didn't have to worry about where the next meal would come from. She didn't have to sleep with one eye open. She could just be a child. But at night, when everything was quiet, Laura still woke up scared. The nightmares didn't disappear easily. The fear of returning to the streets, of losing the little ones, of being alone. Again, Walter noticed his granddaughter's anguish, and on the nights she woke up crying, he would sit by her bed and stay there, in silence, until she fell back asleep. He didn't say anything. He just stayed. And that, slowly, showed Laura that she was no longer alone. The first few months in the mansion were a period of adjustment. Laura still didn't feel completely at home, but she was slowly starting to let her guard down. The children, on the other hand, adapted quickly. Peter, the 7-year-old boy, ran around the house as if he had always lived there. The twins, Michael and Gabriel, aged 5, spent their days playing in the immense garden they had never imagined could exist. And little Sophia, just 2 years old, clung to Laura's legs with the confidence of someone who knows she is safe. Walter enrolled all the children in a nearby private school. Laura protested at first, saying it was too much, that she could study in a public school, but Walter was firm. He said they deserved the best, that he could afford to provide it, and that he would do so with joy. Laura eventually gave in, but always with the suspicion of someone who doesn't believe good things can last. The first time Laura put on the school uniform, she looked at herself in the mirror and didn't recognize herself. The girl who collected cans on the streets had disappeared. In her place was a preteen with clean clothes, a neat haircut and new shoes. But inside, Laura was still the same. She carried the same scars, the same fears. Walter noticed this and respected his granddaughter's pace. He didn't force affection, didn't demand gratitude, he was just present. Mrs. Marlene became a sort of second grandmother to the children. She who for so many years had cared for an empty house now found herself surrounded by life and noise. At first, she complained about the extra work, but everyone knew it was just for show. At night, when she thought no one was watching, Marlene would rock Sophia to sleep singing old lullabies. She prepared Peter's favorite snack without him having to ask. She helped the twins with their homework, even though she hadn't had much schooling herself. That house had become a home again. Laura started attending classes but faced difficulties. She had been away from her studies for a long time and now had to catch up. Moreover, her classmates looked at her with curiosity and sometimes with contempt. Some knew who her grandfather was and commented that Laura was poor, that she had been adopted out of pity. The words hurt, but Laura had learned early on not to show weakness. She pretended not to care and immersed herself in her books. It was on one of those afternoons, while studying alone in the school library, that Laura met Daniel. He was 2 years older, the son of doctors, one of the best students in his class. He sat down next to her without asking and asked if she needed help with math. Laura, proud, was about to refuse, but Daniel was already explaining the problem she had been stuck on for half an hour. He had a simple way of teaching, without making it seem like she was stupid. Laura listened in silence, and for the first time, she understood fractions in a way that made sense. From that day on, Daniel started sitting next to Laura in the library. He helped her with her subjects, and she told him stories about life on the streets that he had never imagined. Daniel listened, fascinated, not with the morbid curiosity of someone who sees poverty as entertainment, but with a genuine interest in the strength Laura had shown. He said she was the bravest person he knew. Laura didn't know how to react to compliments. She was used to fighting, to surviving, but not to being seen. At home, Walter watched his granddaughter blossom little by little. She was still reserved with him, but every now and then she would flash a smile, ask a question about her mother, or ask to see more old photographs. Walter cherished each of these moments as if they were rare treasures. He was relearning how to live. The house full of children forced him out of his routine. He had to listen to complaints about homework, mediate fights between the twins, and watch impromptu theater performances in the living room. It was exhausting, but it was good. It was real. One night, after all the children were asleep, Laura sought out Walter in his office. He was sitting at his desk reviewing contracts, but he dropped everything when he saw her enter. Laura stood at the door, wringing her hands, nervous. Walter motioned for her to sit. They sat in silence for a few minutes until Laura finally said what she had come to say. She thanked him for saving her life, for taking care of the little ones, for trying. She said she was still angry about how he had treated Beatrice, that she probably always would be, but that she was trying to forgive. Walter listened with teary eyes and just nodded. There were no words that could undo the past, but maybe there was time to build a different future. It was around this time that Laura began to think about what she could do to help other children like her. She saw the news on television, heard about boys and girls sleeping on the streets, going hungry, living in danger. She knew she had been lucky to find Walter, but how many other children weren't so lucky? The idea began to sprout in her mind, and the more she thought about it, the stronger her conviction grew that she needed to do something. One morning at breakfast, Laura gathered her courage and shared her idea with her grandfather. She wanted to create a place where street children could go, a safe place where they could eat, shower, sleep and study. But not a typical shelter, full of strict rules and people who were just there doing their jobs. She wanted a place where children were treated with dignity, where they had choices, where they could come and go without fear. A place that felt like a home, not an institution. Walter stopped drinking his coffee and looked at his granddaughter. There was passion in those eyes, determination. He recognized that look. It was the same one Beatrice had when she set her mind on something. He asked if Laura had thought about how to make it work. Laura said she didn't know yet, but if her grandfather helped her, she would learn. Walter was moved. Here was a 12-year-old girl who had just come off the streets, wanting to help others who were still there. How could he deny support to something so noble? Walter agreed. He said he would provide resources, use his contacts, and do whatever was necessary. But Laura would need to study, to understand how existing shelters worked, to learn about social assistance, about child protection laws. Laura agreed, and from that day on she immersed herself in research. She visited public shelters, talked to social workers, read about similar projects in other cities, and the more she learned, the more she realized how much needed to be done. Daniel, her friend from school, also got involved in the project. He was interested in medicine, wanted to be a pediatrician, and saw this project as a way to start making a difference. He accompanied Laura on some visits to shelters, helped organize ideas and suggested partnerships with doctors and psychologists. The two became inseparable partners. Walter looked upon their friendship with affection. Daniel was a good boy, serious, dedicated. He reminded Walter of himself as a young man, before money and pride had changed him. The project began to take shape on paper. Walter bought a plot of land in the Bronx, not far from where it all began. Laura wanted it to be there, near the most disadvantaged communities. The place would have a dining hall, dormitories, classrooms, a library, a sports court, and space for workshops. It would be called Beatrice House in honor of Laura's mother. The idea was that children could come during the day or stay for longer periods if they needed to, but they would always have the option to leave. Nothing would be forced. While the plans moved forward, life went on in the mansion. The little ones grew. Laura dedicated herself to her studies and the project, and Walter rediscovered the joy of being a grandfather. But it wasn't all roses. Laura still had frequent nightmares. She would wake up screaming, calling for her mother, or reliving cold nights on the streets. Walter would hear her and run to her room. Sometimes Laura would let him in, sometimes she would just say she was fine and close the door. He respected her space, but he would stay outside, leaning against the wall, listening until the sobs subsided. On one of those nights, Laura opened the door and found her grandfather sitting on the floor in the hallway. She asked what he was doing there. Walter said he was just making sure she was okay. Laura sat down next to him on the cold floor, and they stayed there in silence, until she finally began to talk. She talked about her mother, about how Beatrice was strong but gentle, about how she worked hard but always found time to listen to Laura's stories. She talked about the fear of forgetting her mother's face, about the guilt of living in comfort while other children were still suffering on the streets. Walter listened to everything without interrupting, and when Laura finished, he just said that Beatrice would be proud of the woman she was becoming. Months passed, and the Beatrice House project began to move from paper to reality. Construction started, but the first problems soon arose. Permits were slow to be issued. Inspections were scheduled and then cancelled without explanation. There was always some missing document, some new requirement that appeared out of nowhere. Walter, accustomed to bureaucracy, found it strange. It seemed more like sabotage than incompetence. It was then that the anonymous complaints began. Someone would call Child Protective Services, claiming that the children in Walter's mansion were in an irregular situation, that he didn't have legal guardianship, that he was keeping minors without authorization. Visits from social workers became frequent. They checked everything, interviewed the children, questioned Laura's relationship with her grandfather. Laura felt invaded, watched. The little ones were frightened by these strangers asking questions. Walter tried to resolve everything legally. He filed for permanent guardianship of the children. He presented documents proving his relationship to Laura, showed that he had the means to care for everyone, and proved that the children were well, attending school, and being monitored by doctors and psychologists. But the process dragged on, and the complaints continued. Laura began to suspect that there was something bigger behind it all. It wasn't normal to face so many obstacles for a project that only wanted to help. She shared her suspicions with Daniel, who agreed. They started to investigate on their own. They talked to people who worked in public shelters, asking discreet questions. And that's how they met Carla. Carla had worked for 10 years as a social worker in city contracted shelters. She was a woman in her early 40s, tired, disillusioned, but still holding on to a spark of idealism. When she heard about the Beatrice House project, she sought out Laura. She said she needed to tell them something, but she was afraid of repercussions. Laura assured her they would be discreet. Carla then revealed something shocking. There was a scheme involving some of the contracted shelters. The more children were taken off the streets and placed in these institutions, the more public funds were released. There were monthly quotas, bonuses for those who met the numbers. The managers of these shelters were paid per child housed. Politicians received kickbacks to facilitate contracts. It was a system that profited from abandonment, and any project that offered shelter without aiming for profit, without feeding that scheme, was seen as a threat. Laura was in shock. She couldn't believe that people would use vulnerable children as a means to get rich. Carla said she had tried to report it years ago but was threatened. She lost her job, was slandered, and almost couldn't find work again. That's why she left the system and now worked for a small NGO, far from all that corruption. But when she heard about Beatrice House, she felt she had to warn Laura and Walter about what they were up against. Walter listened with his jaw clenched in anger. He was not a man to get involved in dirty political games. He had always done business cleanly, honestly. But now he realized he was stepping into a minefield. Laura wanted to give up. She said it wasn't worth fighting against such a rotten system, that maybe it was better to help in other ways. But Walter wouldn't accept that. He said that if they gave up now, those people would continue to profit from the suffering of children, that Beatrice wouldn't have given up, and that Laura wouldn't give up either. It was at that moment that Laura noticed her grandfather's transformation. Walter was no longer the cold, distant man who had kicked his daughter out of the house. He was there, ready to fight for something bigger than himself, for something that would honor Beatrice's memory. And Laura felt that maybe, finally, she could fully trust him. They decided to move forward, but with more caution. Walter hired specialized lawyers, reinforced security at the construction site, and documented everything. Laura started attending Child Protective Services meetings, making her presence known, showing transparency. Daniel helped by organizing dossiers with information about the project. Carla, discreetly, provided guidance on how to navigate the corrupt system without falling into traps. But the pressure mounted. An article in a local newspaper questioned Walter Sterling's intentions. It insinuated that he was using children to clean up his image, that the project was just a facade. There was no proof, only insinuations, but it was enough to tarnish his reputation. Walter was furious, but his lawyers advised him not to respond, not to fuel the controversy. Laura, however, did not remain silent. She gave an interview to a small but honest blog telling her story. She talked about her mother, about life on the streets, about reuniting with her grandfather, about the dream of creating Beatrice House. She spoke from the heart, without filters, without fear. The interview went viral on social media. People were moved, shared it, commented. Public opinion began to swing in Laura's favor. But the project's opponents didn't like it. If before the sabotage was discreet, now it became bolder. The construction site suffered an arson attack. Fortunately, no one was hurt, as it happened in the middle of the night, but there was considerable material damage. Walter had to restart part of the construction. Laura was devastated. She felt she was endangering not only the project, but the safety of her own family. It was then that the children from the mansion did something unexpected. Peter, Michael, Gabriel, and Sophia gathered with Laura and said they wanted to help. That Beatrice House was important and they couldn't give up. That many children still needed help like they had. The purity of those words, coming from children who were still so young but had already lived through so much, strengthened Laura. She realized she wasn't fighting alone. She had a family, and families weather storms together. Walter, touched by the determination of the little ones, decided he would not back down. He hired private security for the site, installed cameras, and increased surveillance. If they wanted a war, they would get one, but he would play fair, within the law, with total transparency. And he would win not by force, but by justice. Meanwhile, at school, Laura faced other challenges. Some students started to tease her, calling her a charity case, an opportunist. Daniel always defended her, but he couldn't always prevent the conflicts. Laura had learned on the streets not to back down, and sometimes she responded to the provocations with the same intensity. She was called to the principal's office a few times for aggressive behavior. Walter would be summoned, listen to the complaints, but never punished Laura. He would just talk to her, explaining that not all battles need to be fought with anger, that sometimes the best response is silence and dignity. Laura tried to follow her grandfather's advice, but it was difficult. She still had that fire inside her, that need to prove she was strong, that she was not a victim. Gradually, with the help of a therapist Walter hired, Laura learned to channel that strength in other ways. She started to write. She poured out everything she felt, everything she kept inside, onto paper, and she discovered that words had power. They could heal, liberate, transform. Months passed, and Beatrice House was finally almost ready. A few finishing touches were needed, but the structure was up. Laura and Walter visited the site whenever they could. Every room had been designed with care. The dormitories were cozy and colorful. The dining hall, spacious and bright. The library, full of new books. There was even a special room decorated with photographs of Beatrice, where Laura planned to tell the children about her mother, about the importance of never giving up on their dreams. But just as the inauguration was scheduled, the hardest blow came. Walter was arrested. The accusation was extremely serious. Mrs. Marlene, the housekeeper who had cared for the house for so many years, presented photographs and testimony, accusing Walter of inappropriate behavior with the children. The images were manipulated, taken out of context, but they looked compromising. Marlene claimed she had tried to report it before but was afraid, that she had finally decided to speak up. Laura couldn't believe it. Marlene had always been affectionate with everyone, had always taken care of the house and the children with zeal. Why would she do that? The answer came days later when Carla discovered that Marlene was being blackmailed. People connected to the shelter scheme had threatened her, saying they would reveal secrets from her past if she didn't cooperate. Marlene, terrified, had agreed. But later, consumed by guilt, she confessed everything to Carla. Meanwhile, Walter was in jail. The children were removed from the mansion by court order. Laura tried to resist, but she could do nothing. Peter, Michael, Gabriel, and Sophia were taken to different institutions, separated. Exactly what Laura had always feared. She saw the little ones crying, begging to stay together, but there was nothing she could do. She felt powerless, destroyed. All the effort, all the love, it all seemed to have been in vain. Laura was placed in the temporary custody of a distant aunt she barely knew. The woman was cold, indifferent, having agreed to take her in only for the money the state would pay. Laura felt invisible again, just another number in the system. Locked in a small room without her siblings, without her grandfather, without Daniel, she fell into a deep despair. She cried until she had no tears left. She wanted to give up on everything. But then she remembered her mother's letter. She took the yellowed envelope she always carried with her and reread every word. Beatrice spoke of strength, of hope, of never giving up even when all seems lost. She said that Laura was special, that she had her own light, that she would light the way for many. And Laura understood that she couldn't give up now. Not for herself, but for Beatrice, for her grandfather, for the little ones, for all the children who still needed help. The next morning, Laura left that house without a word. She took a bus and went straight to the newsroom of the newspaper that had published the malicious article about Walter. She demanded to speak with the editor. When they told her he didn't see visitors without an appointment, Laura sat on the floor of the reception area and said she wouldn't leave until she was heard. She stayed there for hours, motionless, determined, until the editor, curious about the girl causing a commotion, decided to see her. Laura told him everything, about the shelter scheme, about the manipulated photos, about Marlene being blackmailed, about the children being separated. She spoke for almost an hour without stopping, with passion and truth. The editor listened in silence. When Laura finished, he said he needed proof, that he couldn't publish something so serious based only on her testimony. Laura then called Carla, who brought documents, recordings and statements from other people who had been victims of the same scheme. The editor reviewed everything carefully, and he realized he was looking at an explosive story. He told Laura he would publish the article, but that she needed to be prepared for the consequences. Laura said she was, that she had nothing left to lose, that the only thing that mattered was the truth. The story was published in the Sunday edition. It took up 3 full pages with photographs, documents, and testimonies. The headline was direct and impactful: "The System That Profits from Abandonment." Laura was the main source, but others also gave their accounts. Carla spoke about the hidden quotas in the contracted shelters. A former employee of another institution confirmed the schemes of fund misappropriation. Even Marlene, consumed by guilt, decided to speak out and confess that she had been coerced into lying about Walter. The reaction was immediate. The newspaper sold out of its print editions before noon. The online version was accessed millions of times. Social media exploded with comments, shares, and expressions of support. Ordinary people, who had never paid attention to the situation of street children, were suddenly outraged, demanding explanations, calling for action. Politicians who had previously ignored the issue now rushed to make statements, trying to distance themselves from the scandal. Laura followed everything from her aunt's house on the cell phone Walter had given her months before. She read every comment, every message of support, and for the first time in weeks she felt a small spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, the truth would prevail. But she knew the battle wasn't won yet. Walter was still in jail, the children were still separated, and those responsible for the scheme were still free, plotting ways to protect themselves. On the 3rd day after the publication, Laura received a call. It was Walter's lawyer, saying there was news. The judge in charge of the case had requested an urgent review of all the evidence. The photographs incriminating Walter were sent for forensic analysis and were found to be crude forgeries. Marlene gave a new statement, this time telling the truth, and that completely changed the situation. The district attorney's office opened an investigation against the real culprits, and Walter would be released that very afternoon. Laura couldn't hold back her tears. She asked her aunt to take her to the police station where Walter was being held. The woman, annoyed by all the commotion, refused. She said Laura had already caused enough trouble, that she should stay quiet and wait. But Laura was no longer willing to obey orders from someone who didn't care about her. She packed her things and left. She walked to a bus stop, took 3 different buses, and finally arrived at the station late in the afternoon. When Walter walked out the door of the station, he saw Laura waiting outside. She was in her wrinkled school uniform, her eyes swollen from crying, but with a smile on her face. Walter walked over to her and hugged her tightly, as he had never done before. And Laura, who had always been hesitant with displays of affection, returned the hug with the same intensity. They stood there, grandfather and granddaughter, in silence, on the middle of the sidewalk, while journalists took pictures and people applauded around them. But the joy was short-lived. Walter asked about the little ones, and Laura said she didn't know where they were. They had been taken to different institutions, and no one would give her any information. Walter, still shaken from his days in jail but determined, said he wouldn't rest until he brought the children back. In the following days, Walter and his lawyers worked tirelessly to locate Peter, Michael, Gabriel, and Sophia. They discovered that Peter was in a shelter in the South Bronx, the twins in another in the North Bronx, and Sophia in a foster home in Manhattan. They were separated in different places exactly as the system had always done with siblings who didn't have documents proving their relationship. Walter filed legal petitions to regain custody of the children. But the process was slow, bureaucratic, full of obstacles. Meanwhile, Laura couldn't bear the anguish any longer. She knew the little ones must be scared, confused, feeling abandoned again. Especially Sophia, who was still so small and had become so attached to Laura. The girl who barely spoke, who had lived through trauma in her early years, was now in yet another unfamiliar place, surrounded by strangers. It was Daniel who had the idea. He suggested that Laura go to the shelters, try to visit the children, even if she couldn't take them with her. At least so they would know they hadn't been forgotten. Laura thought she wouldn't get permission, but Daniel said it was worth a try. They went together, Daniel driving his father's car, Laura nervous in the passenger seat. The first shelter was Peter's. It was in a peripheral area, an old building surrounded by high walls. Laura rang the bell and explained to the receptionist that she would like to visit Peter. The woman was curt, saying only relatives with a court order could visit. Laura tried to explain that she was like his sister, but the answer was no. Daniel tried to argue, but it was in vain. They left, frustrated. At the second shelter, where the twins were, the answer was the same. Rules were rules. No authorization. No visit. Laura felt helplessness taking over again. But she wouldn't give up. If she couldn't get in, at least she would leave a message. She wrote a quick note telling the twins that she was fine, that her grandfather was fine, and that they would all be together again soon. She asked the receptionist to deliver it. The woman took the paper with disinterest but said she would pass it on. The last stop was the foster home where Sophia was. It was a smaller, more home-like place run by nuns. Laura hoped they would be more flexible there. A nun answered the door and listened to Laura's request attentively. She said she understood the situation, but they really couldn't allow unauthorized visits. However, she suggested that Laura come back another time, perhaps when Sophia was in the inner garden, and they could at least see her from a distance. Laura thanked her and arranged to return the next day. She and Daniel left with heavy hearts, but at least with a small possibility. The next morning they returned. The same nun greeted them and discreetly pointed to a window that overlooked the inner garden. Laura positioned herself there and waited. After a few minutes she saw Sophia. The little girl was sitting alone in a corner, holding a worn-out teddy bear that Laura recognized. It was the bear she herself had given Sophia at the mansion. Sophia looked smaller, more fragile. She wasn't playing, not interacting with the other children. She just sat, there clutching the bear, staring into space. Laura felt her heart break. She tapped lightly on the window, trying to get the girl's attention. Sophia looked in the direction of the sound, but didn't see Laura, who was outside. Laura kept tapping, waving, until Sophia finally focused her gaze and saw her. The little girl's reaction was instantaneous. Sophia dropped the bear and ran towards the window, banging on the glass, crying, shouting Laura's name. Other children and staff looked on, startled. The nuns rushed to calm Sophia, but the girl was inconsolable. She screamed that she wanted to go with Laura, that she wanted to go home, that she wanted the daddy who saved her. Laura was also crying on the other side of the glass, saying she would come back for her, that she wouldn't abandon her. One of the nuns asked Laura to leave, saying she was upsetting the child. Laura wanted to stay, but Daniel pulled her away, saying that if they didn't go now, they could complicate the situation even more. They left, shattered. Laura couldn't stop crying. She said she couldn't leave Sophia in that place. that the girl was suffering, that it wasn't fair. Daniel tried to console her, but he knew there were no words that could ease that pain. He took Laura back to Walter's house, where she was now living again, as the judge had authorized her return while the custody process was being resolved. Walter saw his granddaughter's state and knew what had happened. He immediately called his lawyers, demanding they speed up the process by any means necessary. But the system doesn't operate with urgency when it comes to poor children. The processes dragged on, hearings were postponed. There was always a missing document. Walter used his contacts, applied pressure, did everything he could within the law. But it wasn't enough. The children remained separated, and Beatrice's house remained closed, waiting for an operating permit that seemed like it would never arrive. Public pressure, however, began to have an effect. The newspaper article had generated a wave of indignation that did not subside. Other media outlets began to investigate the shelter scheme, uncovering more irregularities, more misappropriations, more victims. Protests began to take place in front of City Hall demanding action. The scandal was too big to be swept under the rug. It was in this context that something unexpected happened. Sophia ran away. The little girl, just 3 years old, who barely spoke, who seemed so fragile, simply walked out of the foster home one morning when the gate was carelessly left open. No one noticed her absence until lunchtime. When they realized she was missing, they panicked. They called the police, searched the surrounding area, but there was no sign of the child. Laura heard the news on television. A reporter was talking about the disappearance of a child from a shelter, mentioning the name Sophia and showing a photo. Laura screamed, called for Walter, and they immediately went out to search. They went to the foster home, then through the surrounding streets asking everyone if they had seen a little girl with a teddy bear. The search lasted for hours. Night fell, and there was still no sign of Sophia. Laura was desperate, imagining the worst. The girl was too small to be alone on the street, especially at night. Walter tried to stay calm, but he was also terrified. They continued searching, along with volunteers who joined the search after the news spread on social media. It was in the early hours of the morning that Sophia appeared. She walked into a police station holding her teddy bear and told the officer on duty that she wanted to talk to the daddy who saved her. The officer was confused, tried to calm the girl, asked where she lived, who her parents were. Sophia just kept repeating that she wanted her daddy. She described the big house, the garden, the other children. She said her daddy had white hair and was very kind. The officer then made the connection. She remembered the story that was in all the newspapers, of the billionaire who had taken in Street Children, the accusations, the arrest, the revelation of the scheme. She asked if Sophia was talking about Mr. Sterling. The girl nodded her head and said she wanted to go home. The officer was moved. She immediately called the contact she had in the case files and informed them that Sophia was there, safe, asking for her grandfather. Laura and Walter arrived at the station in minutes. When Sophia saw Laura, she ran and threw herself into her arms, crying. Laura held the little girl tightly, also crying, saying she would never let her go again. Walter hugged them both, emotional. The scene was recorded by the station's security cameras and hours later was on every news channel. The story of Sophia walking alone through the streets of New York, determined to find the family that had taken her in, touched the hearts of millions. The image of the little girl asking for her daddy at the police station went viral worldwide. People cried, were outraged, demanded that this family be reunited immediately. The pressure on the system became unsustainable. In less than 48 hours, an emergency hearing was scheduled. The judge, visibly embarrassed by the case's public attention, listened to Walter's lawyers, analyzed the documents, heard testimony from Laura herself, and even from Sophia, who said in her small voice that she wanted to stay with her grandpa and Laura. The judge then made his decision. He granted immediate temporary custody of all the children to Walter, ordering that Peter, Michael, and Gabriel be handed over that same day. When finally, after weeks of separation, the 5 children were reunited again in the mansion, it was as if the house could breathe again. Peter hugged Laura and wouldn't let go. The twins ran to the room. They shared, as if they needed to confirm that everything was still there. Sophia wouldn't leave Walter's side, calling him Daddy with every sentence. And Laura, for the first time since it all began, allowed herself to feel relief. Mrs. Marlene also returned. She apologized with tears in her eyes, explaining that she had been threatened, that she had been afraid, but that she deeply regretted it. It was Laura who said she forgave her, that she understood Marlene had also been a victim. Walter agreed and reinstated her. The house returned to its routine, its life, its love. But the work was not yet complete. Beatrice House remained at a standstill. With the scandal exposed, many of the politicians and managers involved in the scheme were under investigation, some already removed from their positions. But there was still resistance to approving the centre's operation. There were those who feared that this project would expose the system's flaws even further. Laura, however, was tired of waiting. One night at dinner, she made an announcement. She said that Beatrice House would open one way or another with or without a permit. That she herself would go to the streets, invite the children, offer food, shelter and welcome. That if the system didn't work, they would create their own system. Walter tried to argue that they needed to do things by the book, but Laura was firm. She said there were children cold and hungry at that very moment, and she would not wait for more paperwork to help them. Walter looked at his granddaughter and saw Beatrice in her. The same determination, the same courage, the same stubbornness. He sighed deeply and nodded. He said that if Laura was decided, he would support her. But they would do everything documented, transparently, so they couldn't be accused of anything. Laura agreed. The next day, Laura, Daniel and some volunteers who had offered to help on social media went to the Beatrice House building. They cleaned, organized, set up a makeshift kitchen and arranged mattresses. It wasn't perfect, it lacked finishing touches, but it was functional. At the end of the afternoon, they opened the doors. Laura personally went to the streets, to the places where she herself had lived. She spoke with children, with teenagers, with vulnerable young people. She said there was a place where they could eat, sleep, shower, and study, that no one would judge them, that they wouldn't have to do anything in return, that they could come and go as they pleased, that they would be treated with dignity. On the first day, 3 children showed up, suspicious, scared, but hungry. Laura welcomed them with a smile, offered food, showed them the place. Slowly, they relaxed. On the second day, 5 more appeared. On the third, 10. The news spread through the streets. There was a safe place where a girl who understood what they were going through was taking care of everyone. The press, of course, found out. Journalists started showing up, wanting to do stories. Laura gave interviews, but always protecting the children's identities. She spoke about the importance of offering dignity, of treating each child as an individual, not as a statistic. The story gained national attention. What Laura and Walter didn't expect was the public's reaction. Donations started pouring in. Clothes, food, toys, books. Volunteers offered to help. Doctors to provide free consultations. Teachers to give lessons. The public was mobilized. Beatrice House, which had started as the dream of 2 people, was now a movement. But the system doesn't like to be confronted. Attempts to shut the place down resurfaced. Inspectors would show up, claiming irregularities. But now, with all the public attention, any move against Beatrice House was seen as persecution. The social pressure was so great that the inspectors themselves began to offer guidance on how to regularize everything, instead of just creating obstacles. It was during one of these inspections that something important happened. A social worker accompanying the technical visit observed the place's operation for hours. He talked to the children, the volunteers, Laura. In the end, he asked to speak with Walter alone. He said that what they were doing was revolutionary, that this should be the model for all shelters and reception centers in the country, that he himself had worked in institutions that treated children like numbers, and that seeing this reminded him of why he had chosen that profession. The social worker, whose name was Robert, became an important ally. He knew the system from the inside, knew how to navigate the bureaucracy, how to get the necessary permits without compromising the project's essence. With his help, in a few weeks, Beatrice House was fully legalized. The official inauguration was set for a Saturday. It would be a celebration open to the public, with officials, the press, but mainly with the children who were already frequenting the place. Laura wanted it to be a party, not a formal ceremony. Walter agreed and let her organize everything her way. On the day of the inauguration, the place was transformed. Colorful balloons, music, abundant food. The children ran through the garden, finally able to just be children. Officials who had previously created obstacles now showed up to take pictures and make speeches. Laura received them politely, but without hiding her suspicion. She knew many were there, just for the image, not because they believed in the project, but there were also sincere people. Teachers who volunteered to give classes, psychologists who set up a schedule of free counseling, business owners who donated equipment, ordinary people who simply wanted to help in some way. Laura realized that despite all the evil in the world, there was also a lot of good. There were people willing to make a difference. During the ceremony, Laura gave a speech. She climbed onto a small makeshift stage, holding the microphone with trembling hands. She looked at the audience, saw Walter sitting in the front row with the little ones beside him. She saw Daniel, who hadn't missed an opportunity to be there. She saw Carla, Robert, Mrs. Marlene, so many faces that had become important on her journey. And she began to speak. She spoke about her mother, about Beatrice, about how she had faced life with courage and dignity, about how she had taught Laura never to accept scraps, to always value her own honor. She spoke about reuniting with her grandfather, about forgiveness, about the chance to start over. She spoke about the little ones, about the family they had built together. And she spoke about all the children who were still on the streets, invisible to most, but who deserved to be seen, heard, and loved. When she finished, there were tears on many faces. The applause was long, emotional. Laura came down from the stage and was hugged by Walter, who whispered that Beatrice would be proud. Laura believed him. For the first time, she felt she was honoring her mother's memory in the best possible way. Not with sadness or resentment, but with action, with love, with purpose. Beatrice's house was finally open. The following months were a period of consolidation. Beatrice's house operated every day, receiving an average of 40 children daily. Some came just to eat and shower, others stayed for classes, and some spent the night. Laura made a point of being present whenever possible, even with her school routine. She knew each child by name, knew their stories, their pains, their dreams. She treated each one with the respect she herself would have wanted to receive when she was on the streets. Walter, who had returned to managing Sterling markets, now divided his time between his business and the social project. He discovered that managing Beatrice's house was more gratifying than closing multi-million-dollar deals. Seeing the smile of a child who got a job through the vocational workshops they offered was worth more than any financial report. He was finally using his wealth for something that truly mattered. Daniel remained Laura's best friend and partner. He organized fundraising events, mobilized schoolmates for volunteer work, and planned, upon graduation, to work as a volunteer doctor at the house. The friendship between them had deepened, and there was something more too, something neither of them had the courage to name yet. But it was there in the glances, the smiles, the way they supported each other. Peter at 9 became a sort of big brother to the children who frequented the house. He understood what they were going through because he had been through it too. He helped newcomers adapt, taught them the unwritten rules of the street so they could protect themselves, but also showed them there was another way to live. The twins, Michael and Gabriel, now 7, were pure energy. They loved the sports workshops and spent the day playing soccer with other children. Sophia, at 3.5, was completely transformed. She talked non-stop, laughed loudly, and ran through the garden. The silent girl Laura had found in the market that day no longer existed. Life in the Upper East Side mansion had also changed. Walter had renovated the room that was once Beatrice's and turned it into a memorial. He put up photographs, letters, and objects that belonged to his daughter. It was a space of memory, but also of celebration. Laura went there whenever she missed her mother, which was often. She would sit on the floor, look at the photos, and talk to her mother, as if she were still there. She told her about school, about the house, about her grandfather, and she was sure that wherever Beatrice was, she was smiling. The relationship between Laura and Walter continued to strengthen. It wasn't perfect, There were still moments of tension, of disagreement. Laura still carried resentment for what had happened to Beatrice, and Walter carried guilt. But they learned to talk about it, not to let the past destroy the present. They attended family therapy, encouraged by the psychologist who was seeing them, and slowly the wounds began to heal. One night at dinner, Walter made an announcement that surprised everyone. He said he had made an important decision. He was donating the mansion. Laura was confused, asking where they would live. Walter smiled and explained. He wasn't donating it to strangers. He was donating it to Beatrice House itself. He wanted to transform that house, which had been a symbol of loneliness and pride, into a permanent home for children in need. He would buy a smaller, cozier house where he, Laura, and the little ones could live as a real family without all the excess. Laura was speechless. She looked around at the enormous room, the expensive chandeliers, all the luxury, and she realized her grandfather was right. This house had never been a real home. It was beautiful but cold, impersonal. The children could transform it into something alive, warm, full of love. She agreed with the idea, and so did the little ones. Peter said the house was too big anyway, that he preferred a house where he could hear everyone, where he felt closer. The twins and Sophia agreed enthusiastically. The transition took a few months. Walter bought a comfortable but not extravagant house in a middle-class neighborhood. 4 bedrooms, a small garden, a cozy living room. It was perfect. They all moved in together, with the help of Mrs. Marlene, who also got a room in the new house. The mansion on the Upper East Side was completely renovated. The immense rooms became collective but cozy dormitories. The dining room became a cafeteria. Walter's office became a study hall. The house came alive in a way it never had before. The expanded Beatrice House was re-inaugurated in a ceremony even more moving than the first. They could now permanently house up to 60 children, in addition to continuing to receive many others during the day. The house was officially renamed Beatrice House, and a plaque with Laura's mother's name was placed at the entrance. Laura cried when she saw it. It was the most beautiful way to honor Beatrice's memory. Transforming pain into love, loss into gain, absence into presence. The story of Beatrice House began to inspire other initiatives across the country. Business people from other cities contacted Walter for guidance on creating similar projects. Laura gave talks at schools, sharing her journey, encouraging young people to get involved in social causes. The model of care they created, based on respect and dignity, began to be studied by universities and public agencies. It was proven that it was possible to care for vulnerable children without treating them like numbers. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. The scheme they had exposed was under investigation, but things moved slowly. Some of those involved managed to get plea deals, while others remained free using legal loopholes. Laura was frustrated by the slowness of justice, but Walter reminded her that structural changes take time, that the important thing was that they had shed a light, exposed the truth, and that was already making a difference. Carla, the social worker who had helped them from the beginning, was hired as the coordinator of Beatrice House. She was the perfect person for the job. She knew the system, had experience, but most importantly, she had heart. She implemented care methodologies that respected each child's individuality, created psychological support programs, and established partnerships with schools and companies to ensure education and a professional future for the youth. Robert, the social worker who had become an ally, also joined the team. He handled the legal side, ensuring everything operated within the regulations, but without losing the project's essence. Together, Carla and Robert formed an efficient, complementary team, and most importantly, they were genuinely committed to the children's well-being. Laura, now 14, was in her first year of high school. She continued to be one of the top students, especially in writing and literature. She discovered she loved to write, that words were her way of processing the world. She started writing a book telling her story, from the streets to her reunion with her grandfather to the creation of Beatrice House. She wanted other children in similar situations to read it and know that it was possible to change their own destiny. Daniel was still by her side, always. They had officially become a couple a few months earlier, much to the delight of Walter, who was very fond of the young man. Daniel was respectful, dedicated, and intelligent. He treated Laura as an equal, not as a victim or a hero, just as Laura. And that was exactly what she needed. Someone who saw her completely, with her qualities and flaws, without romanticizing her story of overcoming adversity. The little ones continued to grow. Peter showed an interest in engineering, spending hours assembling and disassembling things. Michael wanted to be a soccer player and was already on a youth team for a local club. Gabriel loved to draw and had a natural talent for art. Sophia, the youngest, was discovering the world with infinite curiosity. She asked 1,000 questions a day, wanting to understand everything. Walter said she would be a scientist. Laura thought she would be a teacher. But what mattered was that she had a future, options, possibilities. One day, Laura received an unexpected invitation. A major television program wanted to interview her. It would be a long interview telling the whole story from the beginning. Laura was hesitant. Exposing herself like that wasn't easy. But she thought about how many people could be inspired, how many children could be helped if the story reached more people. She accepted the invitation. The interview aired on a Sunday night. Laura was nervous, but when the cameras turned on and the host began to ask questions, she took a deep breath and was sincere. She told them about her mother, about life on the streets, about her reunion with her grandfather. She spoke about the scheme they uncovered, about the fight to open Beatrice house. She cried, remembering Sophia running away and showing up at the police station. She smiled, talking about the little ones, about Daniel, about the family they had built. And at the end, she made an appeal. She asked people to look at street children not with pity but with respect, not to treat them as a problem but as people, for everyone to do their part, however small, to change that reality. The impact was enormous. The Beatrice House website received millions of hits. Donations poured in from all over the country. Volunteers from various cities offered their help. Other business people and individuals with resources contacted Walter, wanting to replicate the model. The movement was growing organically, genuinely. It was no longer just about one house in New York City. It was about a different way of looking at vulnerable childhood. Months later, Laura was invited to speak before the House of Representatives in Washington, D.C. A bill was being discussed about reforming the child welfare system, and they wanted to hear from her. Laura, at 14, addressed congressmen and senators. She spoke with the authority of someone who had lived the problem firsthand. She said that laws were important, but humanity was even more important, that it was useless to create rules if the people working with children had no empathy, if managers continued to see children as a source of profit. Some politicians listened to her with genuine attention. Others, bothered by her words, tried to discredit her, saying she was too young to understand the complexities of the system. Laura replied that age didn't determine understanding, and that she understood more about abandonment, hunger, and fear than any of those men in suits who had never spent a night on the streets. Her response went viral, becoming a symbol of courage and truth. The bill moved forward with amendments inspired by Laura's speech. It wasn't perfect, there was still much to be done, but it was a start. An official recognition that the system needed to change, that children deserved more than scraps and neglect. Back in New York, life continued its rhythm. Beatrice House celebrated 1 year of operation in the Upper East Side mansion. A party was held with all the children, volunteers, and partners. Laura looked around and felt immense gratitude. A year ago, everything had seemed impossible. Now all of this was real. 60 children had a safe home. Hundreds of others received daily support. And most importantly, they were treated with dignity. During the party, Walter called Laura for a private conversation. He took her to Beatrice's memorial, now part of the house. They sat on the floor as Laura used to do when she went there alone. Walter took a letter from his pocket. He said it was from Beatrice, that he had found it among her belongings that the private investigator had recovered. It was a letter Beatrice had never sent, written years earlier, addressed to her father. Laura took the letter with trembling hands. She read it in silence, tears streaming down her face. Beatrice wrote about forgiveness, about how she held no grudge, about how she loved her father despite everything. She said she understood that his pride came from fear, from wanting to protect even if in the wrong way, that she hoped they could one day reconcile, but if it didn't happen, she was at peace, that she would raise her daughter with love and values, and that if anything happened to her, she hoped Laura could meet her grandfather, because deep down he was a good man, just lost in his own hardness. Laura finished reading and hugged her grandfather. Walter cried as he hadn't cried in a long time. They were tears of relief, of forgiveness received even posthumously, of gratitude for having had a second chance. Laura whispered that Beatrice was right, that he was a good man who just needed to find his way back, and that she was happy to have been part of that journey. The following years brought more growth. Beatrice House opened 2 branches in other parts of New York. The model was replicated in other major cities. Laura continued her studies, wrote her book which was published and became a bestseller, with all proceeds donated to social projects. Daniel graduated from medical school and, as promised, returned to work as the house's doctor. Peter won a full scholarship to an engineering technical school. The twins remained divided between soccer and art, but were happy. Sophia, at 7, was an intelligent chatterbox who wanted to understand how everything worked. Walter, at 78, was more alive than ever. He reduced his involvement in the sterling markets business, passing management to trusted executives, and dedicated most of his time to social work. He said these were the best years of his life, that he regretted not discovering sooner that happiness wasn't in accumulating, but in sharing. On the night of Laura's 17th birthday, Walter made an emotional toast. He said that Laura had transformed his life, that she had saved him as much as he had saved her, that Beatrice would be the proudest woman in the universe if she could see the daughter she had raised, that Beatrice House was proof that love always wins, that it's possible to build beauty from pain. Laura, always more reserved, with her feelings, didn't hold back this time. She stood up and hugged her grandfather, saying she loved him. It was the first time she had said it out loud. Walter returned the hug and said he loved her too, that he loved all those little ones, that he had gained more than he had given. The scene was witnessed by the little ones, by Daniel, by Mrs. Marlene, by Carla and Robert. All with tears in their eyes, all knowing they were witnessing something rare, something true. Beatrice House continued to grow, impacting lives, transforming stories. But the most important thing wasn't the numbers, the statistics, the news reports. The most important thing was that every child who passed through there knew they were seen, heard, and valued. That no one was forced to stay, but everyone was welcome to return. That there was food for the hungry, a hug for those who needed affection, silence for those who wanted peace. That there, finally, children forgotten by the world had the right to exist with dignity. Laura, now a young woman, balanced her studies, social work, and personal life. She planned to study psychology in college, wanting to understand even more about human behavior, about trauma, about resilience. She wanted to be able to help not just by providing structure, but also emotional healing. Daniel supported her completely, saying she would be an incredible psychologist. One Saturday afternoon, Laura returned to the market in the chain where it all began, the same one where she had tried to buy a loaf of bread with insufficient coins years ago. She walked through the aisles, remembering that scared, hungry girl, yet determined to maintain her dignity. She smiled to herself, realizing how much she had changed, but also how much she remained the same in essence. She was leaving the market when she saw a child trying to sell candy at the door, a boy of perhaps 8, thin, with worn-out clothes. Laura stopped and talked to him. She asked his name, where he lived, if he went to school. The boy answered with suspicion, but gradually opened up. He hadn't been to school in months, lived with his sick grandmother, and sold candy to help buy medicine. Laura took a card for Beatrice House from her bag and gave it to the boy. She said that there he could eat, study, get help, that no one would judge him, no one would force him to do anything. The boy looked at the card, then at Laura, suspicious. She understood perfectly. She had been like that too, wary of promises, of adults offering help. She just said that he knew where to find her when he was ready, that the doors would always be open. A few days later, the boy showed up at Beatrice's house. He arrived shy, scared, but he came. Laura received him personally, showed him the place, offered him food, introduced him to other children. The boy ate slowly, like someone who doesn't want to believe that this is real, that it can last. Laura knew that feeling well. She sat next to him and just said that he was safe there, that he could come back whenever he wanted. The boy nodded, and for the first time he managed a small smile. Laura looked around Beatrice's house that afternoon. She saw children playing in the garden, others studying in the library, some helping to prepare dinner in the kitchen. She saw dedicated volunteers, committed staff, partners investing time and resources. She saw life, movement, hope, and she realized that what had started as the dream of a 12-year-old girl had become a solid, tangible, transformative reality. She thought of her mother, of Beatrice, the strong woman who had raised her alone, who had never given up despite all the difficulties. She thought about how happy Beatrice would be to know that her story, her struggle, had not been in vain, that it had borne fruit that now nourished many. Laura whispered a thank you to the sky, to wherever Beatrice was. Thank you for teaching me to never accept scraps. Thank you for showing me that dignity has no price. Thank you for leaving me a legacy not just of life, but of the courage to live it with purpose. Walter arrived at that moment, coming from a meeting with investors who wanted to support the expansion of the house to other cities. He saw his granddaughter observing everything with that reflective gaze and sat down beside her. They stayed there, in comfortable silence, watching life happen around them. They didn't need to speak. They both knew what that moment meant. It was proof that love, when genuine, is capable of rebuilding what pride has destroyed, that it's never too late to start over, that a second chance can transform not just 2 lives but hundreds, thousands. Beatrice's house would continue its work. Children would keep arriving, being welcomed, being seen. Some would stay, others would just pass through. But all would carry with them the certainty that they were important, that they deserved dignity, that they were worth more than the world had tried to make them believe. And Laura would be there, always, keeping the silent promise she had made to her mother. The promise that no child who crossed her path would be ignored, made invisible, forgotten, because Laura knew better than anyone what it was like to be invisible. And now, with a voice, with resources, with purpose, she would dedicate her life to ensuring that other children were seen, truly seen, not as a problem, not as a statistic, not as an object of charity, but as people, children, human beings deserving of respect, care, and love. Night fell over New York City. The lights of Beatrice's house remained on, as always, a beacon in the darkness, a safe harbor for those in need. Laura and Walter went inside to help, with dinner. The little ones were already setting the table. Mrs. Marlene was checking the food. Volunteers were arranging the chairs. It was a simple routine, but full of meaning. It was family, not necessarily of blood, but of choice, of commitment, of love. And there in that mansion that had once been cold and empty, now resonated the laughter of children, conversations, life. The place Walter had built to impress the world had become a home for those who needed one most. And he, the man who had accumulated a fortune thinking it would bring happiness, had discovered late, but not too late, that true wealth was right there at that table full of people, in that good noise of a family gathered, in the certainty that every day he was making a real difference in someone's life. Laura served dinner to the boy she had met at the market. He ate with gusto, but still with that air of someone who can't believe it will last. Laura smiled at him and just said he could eat as much as he wanted, that there was more. The boy looked at her, at this girl not much older than him, but who carried in her eyes the wisdom of someone who has lived too much, and for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to relax. Maybe, just maybe, he could have a different story too. Maybe he also deserved more than just to survive. Maybe he too could live. And so it was, with small gestures, small hopes, small transformations, that Beatrice's house continued to write its story. A story that had begun with pain, but was being built with love. A story that proved that second chances exist, that forgiveness liberates, that family is who stands by our side in battles, not just who shares a last name. A story that Beatrice had started, that Laura had continued, and that now belonged to everyone who believed a better world was possible. End of story. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Laura, Walter, and all the children of Beatrice House has touched your heart. If you were moved by this journey of new beginnings, forgiveness, and transformation, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments which moment marked you the most. Was it the reunion between grandfather and granddaughter? Sophia's courage in running away from the shelter? Laura's fight for dignity even on the streets? Every day we bring intense stories like this one that reveal the deepest side of the human soul, that speak of overcoming, love, and hope. Stories that remind us that it's never too late to start over, that love can heal even the deepest wounds, and that each of us has the power to transform lives. We look forward to seeing you in the next episode with another story that will move and inspire. Until then, remember, you too can make a difference in someone's life.